of the cooperative meetup group. We're going to be reviewing the book, The Comingled Code, which is about proprietary and open source software and how they are both used by both corporations, government, entities, and individuals. I have a mind map shared here because it just helps people to keep pace with the book. Sometimes people don't retain information, or they just read faster or slower than others. So I like to do mind maps in order to help people to have a discussion on the same points. But we can, if other people have notes from the reading, they can go ahead and stop me at any time. Feel free to stop me whenever. And if you have something to share, I can allow you to share or whatever. Just let me know. All right. So a quick overview of open source. It's probably going to be reviewed for some, but maybe not others. There's three eras that open source has gone through. The initial era that open source has gone through is where it wasn't really even called open source, but when software was developed originally, people with researchers, they would share with each other. This is like the early history of Unix, like Bell Labs and Xerox. They would share code with each other, and other researchers would share code with each other. There was no issue with that. The second era started when Bell Labs, or AT&T, started enforcing their rights, or what they thought were their rights. And the within that era, the response was the GNU, or new public license, where people started licensing software that they would develop, that they would share, that would require people to either share whatever the modifications that they would make to the software, or not modify the software and just use it. And also there's other licenses like BSD, so on and so forth. That's not really what we're going to talk about now. And then the last era was the explosion that happened with Linux and things like Apache, where people started using the new public license, the BSD public license, and also the internet allowed people, regular people other than researchers, to collaborate on open source. That's the era since 1991. So we've got that era, and then the book Comingled Code is really an economist's view of open source. There's plenty of books on the economics of open source, but this one has surveys in it, whereas other ones are just really kind of, I don't know, anecdotes, as far as I could see. There are papers that are out there as well, but there's not really too many books that have surveys where they went out and tried to get some type of data. But first, within economics, I guess the book has a good analogy for trying to talk about the incentives for open source that kind of guide what would make an individual create, or try to contribute to open source, or create a new project that is open source, or have individuals or corporate entities refrain from creating open source, and then go and create their software as proprietary. And that analogy is kind of an analogy of cooking, so a recipe. So I can go ahead and read this. So to understand the concept of innovation, It's useful to think of the economy as composed of two elements: a set of ingredients and a recipe by which these ingredients are combined to produce goods and services. The total value of these goods and services is the gross domestic product, or GDP, and the growth and innovation processes increase GDP as the economy acquires more ingredients and uses better recipes. Right? So the ingredients or inputs are labor, so the number of workers, human capital, skills of the workers, so on and so forth, physical capital. 1% increase in all the ingredients leads to 1% increase in GDP. All right, so a recipe is the country's technology. So that is all the different techniques used to produce the products and services. For a given set of ingredients, a better technology leads to higher GDP. One of the things that we need to, I guess, skipping some of this stuff, well, let's go ahead. There's a fundamental difference between the recipe and the ingredients. The use of one of the ingredients by an economic agent prevents anyone else from using it. A recipe is very different from an ingredient. Everyone can use it at the same time. Economists term this as a non-rival good. The use of a new programming technique in one country or by one individual does not hinder its use in other countries or by other individuals. Because the recipe is a non-rival good, once it is discovered, it is efficient to let anybody use it. On the other hand, one must also ensure that individuals and firms have incentives to engage in innovative activities. So this kind of is the crux of the problem here, right? So you want to make a program, essentially is a recipe, right? And it makes efficiencies are what economics is all about. So you have a program, you share it with everyone, and there's more efficiencies. Everyone can do whatever problem the program solves. And so there's more efficiencies, right? But the thing that balances that out on the other side of that is there needs to be incentives to create the recipes and give them out in the first place, right? So, I mean, you might think of somebody that has a good recipe for, let's say, barbecue. Will they, that family recipe, will they just give it out to everyone? Maybe not. If they have a store or a restaurant, maybe they won't. They'll create the restaurant and they won't share it. But if they don't create a restaurant, maybe they'll become famous by sharing the recipe, saying, this is my family's recipe for, let's just say, a barbecue sauce. Here's our recipe for that. And you guys can make it yourselves, but our name will be famous and that kind of thing. We can have marketing benefits from that. So that is the back and forth of kind of the what's commonly we think about with open source and proprietary software and development of it. So it's kind of might be some review for some of you. Let's get into this survey. First off, do you guys have any questions so far?
No, not I.
All right. All right, here we go. So I'll go ahead and go to this survey. And the book had 2 surveys, and let's go ahead and maybe even go back a little bit. The book really divides things into, after going over a history of open source and kind of what is commonly thought of as open source and commonly thought of as the incentives for open source, it goes into an economic discussion of supply side economics and demand side economics. So that's like a thing borrowed within traditional economics, and then you try to apply it to open source. Supply side will be all the people who create the widgets, let's say. And so the open source software in this case, all right? And then the demand side is going to be all of the consumers of the widgets, so consumers of the open source. So on the supply side, what they did was create a survey. And let's see, let's start here. So a survey of software companies, 2,000 firms, 15 countries, right? Within each country, the survey constructed nationally represented random sample software of developing services, of firms to be surveyed. I had an issue with this. As soon as I read through the book, I read it a while ago, and then for this, I read it again for this month, for this meetup. And I had a problem because most software is not made by software companies, right? So I have a link in here which shows that this is the case, right? Only 28% of developers are in the software industry, right? Most software is developed at corporations and not consumed outside of the corporation, okay? So that's kind of a problem I had with the survey that they did, because well, I said not consumed out of the corporation. They should, maybe a lot of software, let's say Twitter, you don't really consider Twitter a software company, okay? But they have created things like Bootstrap that are consumed outside of Twitter. So I don't really like that portion of the survey, but it's still a useful survey. So you just have to keep that in mind. And then also, this book was funded by Microsoft. So that's also something to keep in mind, where there are things within the book where they said, okay, they spent a lot of effort on like a total cost like analysis, and then they spend a lot on government policy. And it's kind of looks like as if they were directed in the survey to spend that time on that in order to get funded. That's what it looks like to me. It doesn't say that in the book, but so within the survey, they created 4 different categories of software companies: pure developers, custom developers, bundle developers, support developers. The bundle developers are put with manufacturing, custom developers. They specialize in customizing software for end users. And there's pure and support, right? So specialize in providing software support services to customers. I want to say Red Hat might be in this support, but I'm not so sure. All right, so some of the outcomes, high-level findings, but some of the outcomes. Open source development is not an isolated phenomenon. 39% of the firms in our survey develop at least some open source software. So it's for software companies, 39% of the companies develop something that's open source. So that's striking to me. I thought it would be less. You guys might think it might be more or less or whatever, but you might think, oh, well, device drivers and all these other things, maybe, okay, 39%, right? Companies that develop open source software typically also develop proprietary software. Okay. Might be striking to you, might not be. Only 15% of the firms devote more than 75% development input into open source. All right. I guess combined with the 39%, then that might be striking or not, but some numbers to keep in mind. Just from that alone, you guys have any questions?
I would like to see how those numbers tie into the different industries, and thinking about what you're saying with regards to firms like, or someone like Twitter versus others. But that would seems like it would be a big analysis. It'd be interesting to see it.
Yeah. Let's see. I had a separation here. The only separation, significant thing that they made for software was here. Operating system versus application. So operating systems are typically aimed at technically sophisticated users. So in-house IT personnel, application software is designed for less computer savvy and final users, and as such needs to be more user-friendly. This is the only separation they made within types of software. So operating system versus, or they also call it system software, but operating system software.
Were there numbers on that with regard to which was open source? Okay, awesome.
They'll be in here, I believe. We'll get into some of it.
Okay, cool.
I didn't pull it out, then it's in the book. All right, so let's go. Any other questions so far? All right. High-level findings. They have a lot of findings I don't so much care about as far as like the different countries. I'm just biased because I'm thinking of the United States, but I'll go ahead and talk about some of them. The first is propensity to engage in open source development of varies across countries. Formal statistical test allows us to reject the hypothesis that countries are the same once we control for other factors. But it turns out that only 3 countries stand out as different from the rest: Kenya, Singapore, and South Africa. Software developers in Kenya have significantly higher probabilities of engaging in open source than other countries, while the opposite is true for Singapore and South Africa. The first is that the propensity to engage in open source development varies across countries. A formal statistical test allows us to reject the hypothesis that countries are the same once we control for other factors. But it turns out that only 3 countries stand out as different from the rest. And like I said, those 3. So I think I might have copied that twice. Yep. Sorry about that. Let me clean that up later. So the finding shows that open source development activity is not, as some have claimed, a phenomenon particularly associated with or concentrated in developing countries. Second finding is that large firms are significantly more likely to engage in some open source activity than other small or medium-sized companies. But at the same time, the large firms are less likely to specialize in open source. So interesting thing to try to keep in mind, but probably hard. Now, those are high-level findings. Let's do the conditional and marginal findings. A little bit more complicated because we're going to start talking about statistics. So firms tend to do A and B together, but not all firms combine them. So then knowing that a firm does A should tell us that it is also likely to be doing B. All we do is formalize this simple intuition to illustrate. Consider the following simple case where the overall proportion of firms engaged in A is 40%. This is called a marginal frequency. Suppose that the 80% of the firms that do A also engage in activity B. This is called the conditional frequency. All right. So you got marginal and conditional frequency. Let's go and talk about that. It is less likely for a firm to be developing application software if it is also doing operating system software, and vice versa. Thus, they indicate that operating systems and application software are alternative, not complementary areas of expertise for software firms. That's something that I would just not be thinking, because I think of Microsoft and I just think of, if you're going to make the operating system, you're going to try to make other things on top of it and try to exploit your platform position, but this says the opposite, right? So that's striking. Firms are substantially less likely to work on proprietary applications if they work on open source operating systems or applications. Okay, think of Red Hat proprietary applications. If they work on open source operating systems, they're working on open. Yeah, it seems right. Companies are about twice as likely to develop an open source software for operating systems if they also develop an open source software for applications. That's okay, weird. And if they develop proprietary software for operating systems. Okay. Firms are more than twice likely to develop open source applications if they also do open source work on operating systems. All right, fine. Any questions there?
Oh.
All right. All right, synergies. These numbers indicate cost or marketing synergies that operate in two dimensions: between open source and proprietary software for operating systems, and between open source software for operating systems and applications. They didn't find any evidence for synergy between open source and proprietary applications. So I could probably go in here and bold this stuff, and it would be a little bit more clear. All right, but that's what the difference is that they're making here. Right. These linkages between software customization and bundling and software and support services and bundling software are not surprising. In fact, there are many examples of such behavior. We all know about IBM. They did this massive change between like just being mainframe to actually making I believe most of their money from services now. So this is their kind of also predicts that or accounts for that. There's a strong synergy between open source proprietary licenses for software bundled in hardware. This holds true for both software bundled in the same firm's hardware and in hardware produced by other firms. That's something that is interesting. Like some of us are talking about networking things, white box switches, when we're within a networking space, writing software, open source software for hardware that's developed by, let's say, Big Switch or, some Intel or Broadcom. There's a strong synergy for that for whatever reason. So that's a space that's active right now. So Raymond, one of the leading apostles for the free software movement, asserts that open source is something separate and fundamentally different than a traditional software, a new radical alternative that will largely displace the existing proprietary regime. As he puts it, in the future that includes competition from open source, we can expect that the individual destiny of any software technology will be to either die or become part of the open infrastructure itself. Right. While this is hardly happy news for entrepreneurs who would like to collect rent on closed software forever, it does suggest that software industry as a whole will remain entrepreneurial, with new niches constantly opening up at the upper application end and a limited lifespan for closed IP monopolies as their product categories fall into infrastructure. So that I found that to be quite interesting. So, do you guys have any questions or comments?
Rowan has some chat questions there.
Okay. Let me see some of those.
I think the Bayesian.
Yeah, you kind of went over it.
Okay. So you said Bayesian, not from, did we already covered it or you still had a question?
I was just kind of wondering what statistic. There was something that you were reading where it kind of sounded like Bayesian inference or whatever Bayes algorithm is, the like A, B, whatever.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking out loud.
Okay. Statistics are evil, but okay. Yeah. Let's see here. Any other questions?
So did you say, just for like clarification, if an entrepreneur wanted to make money off of this proprietary software, it's just like the statistic is essentially bad news because most software either dies or becomes part of the open source world. What was the last comment you made?
This guy saying that. This guy saying that. What I really need to do is put this higher up, but I'm not gonna do that right now. This Raymond, he's old school, open source. I think Cathedral and Bazaar essay. If you've never read it, it's an essay to read. That's like a classic within open source. And he's going to be kind of like an evangelist of open source. His thing is that, and so this is not coming from an economics perspective at all. So, I'll just go ahead and add that right here. Mm-hmm. Not an econ economics perspective, right? So his thing, they put that in there to contrast, I think, but it was to, I forget what software he made. I think he made a part of the mail software, SMTP, or some fundamental SMTP implementation that used to be like prevalent. So that was his claim to fame. But the thing that I found was interesting here is he said that your software, if it's actually useful, it's going to turn into infrastructure eventually. So we're going to rewrite it in open source. It's going to be infrastructure. And so you need to stay up on the top end of the innovation, developing new things. If it's, as it becomes more useful, he's kind of saying that the more useful things that are broadly used are infrastructure. I tend to agree with what he's saying. But I think to answer your question, somebody is trying to be entrepreneurial, you need to stay up on the top. If you're doing something that everybody uses, somebody's going to rewrite it as open source.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've been trying to, the software is fetch mail, by the way. It was for retrieving mail and putting it on your local box.
What, you remember the name?
Say again?
Well, you remember the name of it?
Fetch mail. Fetch mail.
Fetch mail. Okay.
Fetch mail.
Cool.
And trying to, in the ecosystem here, we have people who are angel investors, and they're looking to invest money, just like stock market, right? They want to invest in a company and see the returns as high as possible. And then you've got people that do soft loans, and the soft loan people are interested in what's going on and they want their money back. They're not necessarily looking for an increase on that. And then you've got impact investors that are looking to make a profit, but are doing so out of a motivation because if the return's not that high, they're not going to stress, but they do want a proper return. And then you've got philanthropists who are just, I like what's happening here and I want to contribute. And let's take the four of those people up there, and they're all trying to spend money on things that they want to happen and then return what they're interested in. But I find that they're putting them all into little gardens of their own. They're not in the big shared garden, the public space, and the money gets wasted, right? And I like where was the corollary just here a moment ago you went across that it's a waste of money, it's not efficient. The efficiencies of going in, well, we spent 50% of the budget for each of those, and they all failed. Let's say there were 4 different projects and all 4 failed. Well, now you have 200% of that money, let's say if it was all the same, going into things that are useful again. That is like a concrete way to explain why open source and shared commons and investing in things, so they not only is it like the software that's available, but the humans that put that together, if they're in your local area or you have access to employ them, now you have that. There was a list of somewhere in here what you need to exist. You need to have the software, and then you got to have the people, and you got to have the ideas or something like that. Anyway, just some comments.
as far as resources. Okay. Anyone else? All right. So let's go into some differences between open versus proprietary. We're already at 7:40, so I might try to skip over some of this. There's no sharp divide between open source and proprietary worlds for software developer communities, in sharp contrast to the conventional wisdom that has taken over much of the debate. Commingling occurs in settings where firms have the most to gain. In particular, firms commingle, meaning using open source and proprietary, where they can exploit opportunities to lower development and marketing costs. All right, so that's a synergy. Examples include combining development of customized software together with the provision of support services, developing both open source and proprietary software for operating systems, and greater commingling of open source and proprietary software in large firms where this can be done without sacrificing the benefits of economies of scale. The evolution of open source has involved a gradual shift towards greater firm-based development and funding, right? So some of us on the call, we're experiencing that where it's just big companies funding open source, and it's kind of like, what's going on here? All right, diversification. Second factor that determines the scope for diversification is demand, or the size of the market. Adam Smith, now we're getting into some real economics, first observed that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. It does this because the size of the market affects the ability of firms to make money through specialization. If there are cost advantages to being larger, economies of scale, firms can only exploit them profitably and cover their fixed costs if the market is large enough. This also applies when there are both economies of scale and potential advantages to combining different activities, economies of scope. Thus, both the level and composition of demand affect how firms diversify. Any questions? This stuff is starting to get a bit heavy. I'll stop here. If not, let me go ahead and talk about diversification. The following are the dimensions of diversification. The software focus is combining development of applications and operating system software. Software focus by license type, right? Skip down. Business models, combining development of separate packages or packaged software, bundled software, so not tied to hardware. Customized software, software bundled with hardware, supplied by the firm. Software bundled by hardware provided by other firms. License type and business models, combining open source and proprietary software with some set of business models. And let's go ahead. Okay, this is important. The decision of software firms to diversify and the pattern of that diversification are driven by two main factors, cost synergies and demand factors. Cost synergies arise when doing two or more activities together is less costly than doing them separately. Economists refer to such cases as economies of scope. When they are present, we expect to see firms exploiting the opportunity for cost savings by diversifying into both activities. Economies of scope can take two forms: cost synergies in the development of software and marketing strategies in the distribution and sales of software. All right. So you got cost, you got marketing. These are reasons why in the survey we saw what we saw where people are diversifying. Let's see. Some of the reasons why corporations might jump in to developing open source are visibility of being a core contributor. Part of this is a public relations. play, but there are other more tangible reasons. In particular, their clients will be more willing to buy support from them if their employees are top contributors to the programs. This provides a guarantee of the depth of competence within the firm. Firms try to influence the development of the open source program, and open source software serves as advertising or as a way to make potential users aware of the functionalities of the proprietary software. All right. By providing some software freely, the firms increase the demand for their proprietary products, which are made more valuable by the increased size of the installed base. That's network effects or network externalities. Some of these benefits can be realized by freely distributing the proprietary software. So just like Adobe does, it's not open, but they freely distribute it, right? And that increases the demand. Distributing on an open source license also has greater advantages as providing users with a guarantee that if the firm changed strategy, the product would still be available and furthermore could still be improved by others. So that is a big part of open source. All right. Any questions before we go into this corporate incentives? And I'm going to jump over to this demand side as fast as I can. And we're going over pretty fast. But. All right, so corporate incentives. Corporations increasingly invest large amounts of money to finance open source development, both in terms of direct finance to other companies and through paying their employees to engage in such an activity. This comes from the survey, by the way. It's not just them saying it, right? There are at least two reasons why companies provide such financing. The first is encourage and influence the direction of open source innovation in the hope that they can exploit the knowledge in their own software programs. This is akin to what economists call pure knowledge spillovers, right? And then the second reason for for supporting open source activity is the hope that results can be embodied typically after customization in the computer hardware produced. So there's lots within this book, lots of things about the bundling of hardware and software if you're interested. I'm not so much interested. So 15.3% of firms developing open source receive corporate funding. Good stuff, right? Nearly 2/3 of these firms report that this funding is highly important for encouraging their open source activity. We got IBM spending hundreds of millions. You know about that if you're within the community for a while. Firms that specialize in customized software and software for bundling the other firm's hardware are more likely to get funding than those focused on separate packaged software and support services. So hardware, right? Maybe I should be more interested in hardware. Large firms diversify more than smaller ones, as they're more likely to be able to exploit the cost synergies without sacrificing economies of scale. All right, let's go ahead and get out of here. Firms that do a particular open source activity frequently also do that activity under a proprietary license form. That is counterintuitive. Any questions before we go over to demand? Got about 15 minutes, so.
A lot of this sounds like how companies used to run, and like R&D, IBM and Boeing and other groups where they dump lots of development there, and it's kind of an extension of doing some of that.
Okay.
Especially the pure knowledge spillover. So rather than just doing it internally, if it's open source, then maybe you're going to get more back from what you would have in an internal R&D.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting something like the equivalence of like Boeing or the Skunkworks projects and whatnot, where that is shifted from being something that's invested in internally to where open source is kind of like a doing skunkworks in the open.
Yes.
You guys might. There's a guy. His name is. I'm probably not going to pronounce his name properly. It's like Michael Isanti. He's a Harvard researcher, and his thing is just talking about R&D and integration. So how we moved from R&D, big R&D portions within, let's say, government funding the R&D, right? And then corporations also having big R&D portions, to where it started being to where they tried to push everything out in the R&D portions or R&D sections, divisions within the big corporations like the Bell Labs and all that, they're gone now, right? So the evolution of that to what we have now, where they try to outsource as much as possible and try to get as much people to do things for free as possible. And he links it to Microsoft, or like an example would be Microsoft, where, you know, they develop the platform and then have everyone else develop things on top of the platform, and then just buy whoever's either the winner, or oftentimes like Microsoft strategy would just really, they would buy the loser or somebody who was in the middle and then kill everyone else and bring it on. So they wouldn't do any research. So you go from the 60s and 70s to platform strategy, which is essentially don't do any research and just bogart everybody through your I guess you could call it monopoly power. So there's like, would you guys agree that there is no Bell Labs now? The equivalent of a Bell Labs?
Yes.
Yeah.
I miss the Xerox days, eh?
Yeah. So this book doesn't say that, but that guy does say that. He has a nice history of it. That's what his.
Did we put his name in the notes?
I can't spell it. Well, I have to. Let me write it down.
That's enough to, because the name's not even sticking in my head.
Let me write it down. Hold on. Michael. So,
Thanks, Watson.
I'll put it in there.
Thank you.
All right. Let's go over to demand side. All right. Just high level overview. Their a big part of the demand side is, so demand side is the users buying something. Like, so what do the users look like when they want to buy open source or use open source or whatever, right? That's the demand. Big part of it, total cost of ownership, and whether or not you even do a total cost of ownership analysis to figure out what you should buy, right? So if you're not doing that, they put you in a different category. Essentially, you're not even looking before you leap to these people if you're doing a significant purchase. All right. So by the demand side, we mean the way in which software users assess the alternative offerings available in the market and how they make their choices among them. All right, so let's go ahead. There's something significant. There's no such thing as the cost of software, right? Each piece of software involves a variety of different costs for a user. Some costs are explicitly monetary, such as the initial purchase price of software, but other costs are of adoption, such as learning or interoperability, are more disguised, though nonetheless real. Some costs, initial price of software, are lower for open source, but others are higher. In other words, in their adoption decisions, users face trade-offs, and their choices will depend on how much importance they attach to the individual types of costs, which determine the relevant total cost of operation or ownership of the various software options consumers face. Consumers are heterogeneous in terms of how they assess the different components of costs. For small firms that are cash constrained, for example, the initial purchase price of software may be particularly important, but far less so for larger companies, right? So other components such as learning costs may be the dominant consideration for application software for technically less sophisticated users, right? So also important, right? Not only do consumers make different choices, but they also can and do mix and match open source and proprietary programs. All right, so now we're going to go into the survey for the demand side. All right. Within each country, they did multiple countries. Survey company constructed a nationally representative random sample of businesses within the target industries and government agencies. This is my note. Why did they do non-software companies on the demand side and they did only software companies on the supply side? That was irritating, right? Like I said, most software is developed by non-software companies. So it's kind of like they knew what they wanted to do here, right? It's kind of like if they went to, if they did the supply side and they started doing corporations and they saw an insane amount of open source being used, like Apache and all this other stuff, it would kind of mess their numbers up. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm being a conspiracy theorist, but whatever. Individual pirate users or not.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, you think so?
I heard individual pirate users.
Yeah, exactly. I had a Freudian slip, right? So individual private users were not surveyed. The list of companies was compiled from the registry of firms, whatever. All right, so now let's get more into the survey. Overall sample, 59.5% of users report that they use total cost of ownership analysis. This is good news, but at the same time, it is a concern that 40% apparently don't care. The decision to use TCO is strongly related to the size of the user. Small users, much less likely, whatever. Large, more likely. Low tech manufacturing, they don't care. That's a theme, and they spent a bunch of talking about it. Manufacturers, they're like, hey, we're fine with making the software that hardware manufacturers. We're fine with making the software that runs on our system. So, for instance, white box networking switches, making it open source. Because they are confident that I guess they're confident in their hardware prowess or whatever, but the synergies there, they think that it's good, right? More so than other developers, software developers, companies. Government agencies, less likely to do TCO, right? Yep. They do not. Government agencies, just anecdotal, they do not like paying you to tell them how much you are going to charge them. They hate that, right? And they hate paying someone else to tell them how much you are going to charge them. Kind of, when you put it like that, it seems kind of reasonable, but you know, whatever. Total cost of ownership. Yeah. Right. Yes, of course. Proprietary software is subject to competitive pressure, whatever. All right. Cost components. 5 cost components. Initial software price, switching costs, interoperability costs, access and cost of support services. So that's total cost of ownership, cost components, right? So if you're a developer, I know I always put all of my thought on the initial software price. I hardly ever think about switching costs and interoperability costs and access and cost of support. I don't care about that it's documented well and it's painful for you, I don't care, right? Normally, it's hard for me to concentrate on that, but people care about that stuff. So, but let's see, how much do they care? Initial cost of price software is the top ranked element for both proprietary and open source software. That this is true for open source software is striking. It illustrates that users often buy open source programs in forms that make their installation more user friendly. Red Hat, Novell. Well, if Novell's still around, I haven't looked at them for a while, but Red Hat. Users much more often rank switching costs and interoperability as the primary factor for open source than for proprietary software. So users versus, I believe, corporations, right? Switching costs, interoperability, right? So an interesting little thing, but total price is still the best. Initial cost of software accounts for the small percentage of total costs for open software. Open source for the whole distribution of responses. All right. Support services account for a larger proportion of total costs for open source than proprietary software. Okay. This conclusion reflects the fact that open source is typically less user-friendly than proprietary software. So something to think about, right? Not accompanied by extensive support services. Right. All right. Somebody else put this in here. That's nice. Switching and interoperability costs account for a larger proportion of total costs of open source than for proprietary software. And that this holds over the entire distribution. You guys, that seems striking to me too. All right. So there's virtually no difference between open source and proprietary curves and cost of upgrades, right? So this is a striking one. This suggests that proprietary software exposes the consumer to less risk of latter holdup than is commonly believed, or that if such holdup risk does exist, there are also very real costs associated with the frequency and upgrades or the lack of well-documented upgrades in open source.
Can I get some clarity on what you think they're saying in there?
Right, that part or a different part?
No, what you got highlighted right now.
Yep.
The holdup, or are we talking about the I imagine like your process is being held up within this thing that's not, you can't export it out of, or it being like holding it's proprietary, right? So you can't get access to your things. They're locked up. Hold up. Is that what they're saying, or is there something else that I'm missing?
He said cost. This one is cost of upgrades.
Just the cost of upgrades.
Yeah.
Hold up. I don't understand how hold up relates to cost of upgrades, but go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to say if you can't upgrade a certain, like go to the next version of an open source project, let's say Rails. Rails is notorious for, oh, we're on Rails, I don't know, people on Rails 2, right? And they're like, I don't want to upgrade because they're no longer supporting all that stuff like that, and they don't really care to support Rails 2. These types of things. So they want to stay on the same version forever, even with the security problems, even all that stuff like that.
Yeah, that's what the holdup is. Fair enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Right. That's interesting though. I find it really interesting because people think of cost of upgrades. You think of open source, you think of less cost altogether, but cost of upgrades, I guess, it's significant for proprietary in order to they make it smooth enough to make it to where people they end up not feeling the pain, or feeling the pain just as much as open source, or it's equal, even though you're not paying for upgrades on your open source. So open source upgrades must be painful as hell, and proprietary must be really nice because of well documented or whatever. It's not something that I would think of, but this is the survey. This is all under the survey. So, all right. Let's see. We're talking about findings now. Let's get through this. Probably a more important part of the survey. Striking fact: strong differences across countries and the way they assess the cost. All right. Whatever. The second finding: the size of the user has significant effect on the user assessment on some components, but not others. Size matters for support services, both in proprietary and open source. They're thinking that the initial cost of software is likely to be more important for users in the lower income countries, and thus they expect the relative cost share for other components will be smaller in those countries. Most surprising result is that ownership and industry of the user do not affect the importance of most cost components. The only exceptions are ownership matters for support services and upgrades, inspection of the individual regression, blah, blah, blah. Government agencies assess that the cost factors to be more important than the domestic companies. So this is the part where I think in the book, I think they were paid to do the surveys and really concentrate on government stuff. So it's kind of interesting though. Governments don't do TCO, and let's see, plausible explanation, technical expertise need to exploit ongoing improvements in open source software, typically less user-friendly, may be less strong in government agencies, and budgets too small to allow them to go to the market for such help. Level of software infrastructure and technical expertise possessed by and available to software users. Our hypothesis is higher levels of expertise and infrastructure will reduce the cost of complementary services need to integrate software. And then they started saying the software piracy rate in each country could affect this whole situation here. So let's see. In many cases, the cost of software is a small part of the total cost of running a system. And a comparison of the total cost of ownership will depend on the allocation of the internal costs of the firm, particularly labor costs. Among the firms, here's some numbers. Among the firms for which corporate sales account for more than 75% of the revenues, 30% say that switching costs is the most important obstacle to their customers adopting open source software. 29% say that support services are a leading obstacle, and 40% software quality is dominant, right? Let's see. And they go into this discussion of quality and say that it's kind of difficult to talk about quality. Switching costs appear to be more important for customers of operating system software, while quality is top ranked for applications. That's back to Taylor when you're talking about separating the different types of software. Here's one important one. So switching costs appear to be more important for customers of operating system software, or to them, really system software to us, while quality is top ranked for applications. Users mix. They use both proprietary and open source. Users who give more importance to switching costs and operability and support services are more likely to use proprietary software. Users who, by contrast, put more weight on the initial cost of software lean more towards open source. So that is a striking thing to me. Switching costs, you kind of think of open source. Interoperability, maybe too. You don't think of proprietary, think of open everything. Support, yeah, proprietary. But within their survey, that's what they came up with. And I think it's because of like the cost of upgrades problem, documentation problem. They think the switching costs are just too painful on the open source side. So something to keep in mind. Users mix lots of software constantly. All right, any questions so far? We got about, I'm gonna go for another 5 minutes and then we can close it. Okay. Government stuff. Whoa. Whoa. All right. Governments account for 21% of software. Of the money that's paid on software. So remember that. I've seen higher in other things, but fine. Right? So they're a big customer. Big part of this is if you're a big customer, what's your strategy for controlling your suppliers? Right? It's a big part of economics is talking about strategies for controlling, minimizing your price, not just for people who are selling products, but also people who are consuming products, right? For big entities that are consumer products, right? So given that, they're also going to go ahead and say, yeah, government, don't fiddle around with everything. That's essentially what ends up happening in this book. Government incentives for software adoption. Incentives can take the form of direct subsidies, tax credits, all that stuff. Fine, whatever. 2 types of quality, right? This is important. Just economics. Vertical differentiation and horizontal differentiation. Vertical differentiation is what you think it is. All consumers rank it better, right? So you could think of a Mercedes better than a Pinto, if they even still make Pintos. And automated, they do Hugo. Okay, whatever, Hugo. They don't make those either, right? But comparing a Mercedes and a pickup truck, that's a horizontal, right? Because somebody might use the pickup truck to move things. It could be something that's not even well built, but they want to move things from one house to another, okay? So that's a horizontal differentiation. Innovations, they go ahead and talk about if you try to play around with the market, then you might screw around with the innovations. But here's some game theory. I find it interesting. I don't know if you guys would be. So basically, just for game theory, just to understand what this is, they're saying that this is a game, and this is one player, this is another player. Big player is government, but it could be you as a big, massive company that has a significant, like 21% of the money that within a space as a consumer, whatever. This number here goes to this side. The one that's on the left side goes to the left side. The one that goes on that's on the right side goes up. So there's 2 strategies. They're essentially saying, I mean, I could read this out to you, but they're essentially saying if you're a big player, you can go with the status quo, or you can opt for a change. So government within open source, they could say, hey, all you guys need to behave in such a way to where, let's say networking equipment, let's say containerization, let's say whatever. You guys need to play nice, and with each other and go down this road. Otherwise, we're not purchasing from you. Another way to look at it, for service providers in the networking, AT&T, China Mobile, all these guys. You guys, NEMS, the Cisco, all you guys better play nice and go and open up your stuff, right? Or they can go along with all the other service providers and say, yeah, go ahead, let's go with the status quo. Go ahead and keep your stuff closed. That's essentially what this game is, right? So if everybody works together, or if people just continue on their path with the status quo, that would be like the A, and you get a payout of 9, you get a payout of 8. But if you're a big player, this payout right here is nice, the 10, and it's not quite the 11, but the others are not playing the B, right? B is them contributing nicely and all that. They're going ahead and doing the A. What you want to do is get everybody over here. If you're a big player, you want to get everybody over here, right? So you send out this massive signal that we want to open up white box switches. You're going to do nice. You're going to play nice with each other, write open source software. You're going to do all this stuff, right? And the small players, they're all going to go along with you, right? And then you would get a payout of this, which is the 6 is for the others is better than 5. So that's really this over here is a leadership strategy, right? As a player, B is a leadership strategy, A is an adaptive strategy. Okay, this as much as I'm going to go over that. You guys want to talk more about game theory and stuff like that? Something I like, so we can talk more about it later. And you guys have any questions? All right. Then you got price discrimination. It's basically like this is read it. The customization of price, the reality of the particular market is a normal part of business. Economies refer to it as price discrimination. It's a well-known principle of economic theory, and that in industries with large fixed costs, such as software, such price discrimination is both privately and socially beneficial under very general conditions. In the absence of price discrimination, one would expect open source software available at a lower per cost to be comparatively more attractive in developing countries. In the presence of price discrimination, comparative attractiveness will depend on how aggressively proprietary software firms differentiate prices across regions. So you're going to have to make a better mousetrap, essentially. So purchasing decisions on neutral evaluation procedure based on explicit criteria at the same time imposing open specification standards will be important. Competitive pressure put on open source and proprietary software providers, and opening competitions as many suppliers as possible enhances the bargaining position of government. So more of the stuff about governments and everything like that. Any questions at all? You guys hear me still?
Yeah. A lot of content on this side.
It is.
And I can see the shift, as you were saying, where they did the analysis of large entities on one side that don't produce software.
Right.
Others.
Yep. If there are no more questions, I am going to close and then we can continue to talk if we want to.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks.